Welcome to the Is It Time for a Lawyer podcast with attorney George Lamb. Each brief episode will focus on a specific legal topic to help you better understand the situation you're in and what your next steps might be. Let's join George for this episode. And friends, we're back with attorney George Lamb, and today we're going to continue our discussion on family law, but today we're going to specifically focus on child support calculations and related issues. George, welcome back to the studio. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Buddy, I'm doing well. Having been through a divorce myself, this is familiar territory, so we'll hopefully add some insights here. And there's always stuff, as we prep for this, there's stuff that you bring up that either didn't affect my situation because all of them are different, but it's interesting perspectives from an attorney standpoint that's always good to know, and I hope the audience actually picks up some pretty good information here. So, we've had a series of podcasts so far. This is episode 5, but we've gone back and talked about a whole bunch of different topics, and I'll share some of those. I'll link to some of those in the show notes, but you can find all of these on the website as well as Spotify, iHeartRadio, and the mix of different platforms out there. But for today's purposes, let's go ahead and jump into child support calculations and issues. Where do you want to kick it off?
Generally, I'd like to talk about child support. It's a big, important topic when it comes to family law. Generally speaking, if you're unmarried parents or you're not together with the person that you have a child with, be it a divorce, a custody case, a paternity case, they can be called different things depending on your situation. The concepts are relatively the same. The general notion is that kids need money to be supported, and the thinking is, and the standards are that you have to look at the family's income, the respective income of the parents, to determine how child support is calculated, and then how money flows, if it's going to flow, from one parent to the other. Because the assumption is that the child receives the same proportion of income as they would if the parents had not divorced. Now, I'm not saying that that's perfect, because it's not going to be, because anybody in these situations, it's an economies of scale concept. You still have two households where maybe you used to have one. And so one of the common themes and challenges, quite frankly, is that generally speaking, you have the same amount of income as if you were together, but you have double the expenses, and then the consideration is that you have a child or children that are flowing between two houses in some, or two houses or homes in some manner, and it needs to be accounted for.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, again, as you said, the expenses significantly increase sometimes. When you look at the overall picture, you've got two separate parents now, but one of them didn't have a house payment. Now there's an additional major expense in there, and you're still trying to figure this out, split between, as you said, sometimes relatively similar income levels, and it's difficult. I mean, it really can be difficult.
An analogy that comes to mind when it comes to that overarching expense is that, if you're in a relationship and you're living with that person, you're in a relationship, that's fine. You have children, that's fine. Or you have a kid, that's fine. But generally you're roommates. And then you're not going to be roommates anymore. And so you have to have those two independent living situations. And anybody out there knows that, if you just throw out a number, if you have a place that's big enough for 2 or 3 people, and it might cost, I don't know what that would cost. If it costs $2,000 a month total, and then you have to have 2 of them, that's $2,000 each. And so it's going to be a strain. I wouldn't think that it wouldn't be, but understand that when child support is calculated, the state law has, for lack of a better term, a chart. They have a worksheet. It's embedded in the state law. It's called a guideline. And so what it does is it says, okay, you have this income from this parent and this income from that parent, and it's a monthly income, and it's your gross income. And so whatever this gross income is and that gross income is, you could say gross income parent A, gross income parent B. You add those together, and then you go through the chart, and it will say, okay, based on this income level combined between the two parents, depending upon the number of children that they share, this is the amount of money that it takes. I wouldn't necessarily say to raise the child, but this is the amount of money that the state has said or calculated that this is the money. And then the question becomes, how does that get divided? Or how does money, if it's going to flow from one parent to the other?
Yeah, and that child support calculator, I'll put a link to that in the show notes for today's episode. Now, different firms may use slightly different tools, but I think the state does actually issue a child support calculator, which is more or less just a sheet with some multipliers and some other charts that you plug in. So it's something you can, for the most part, walk through. But once they figure out, okay, this should be the expenses, you also have the opportunity to put in some other expenses that specifically relate to your household. Is that correct? I mean, if there's schooling, if there's healthcare, different things like that, doesn't that come into play as well?
Yes. So it's not just the amount that comes out of the chart. Anybody with kids out there knows that there's going to be health insurance for kids, and generally speaking, it's going to be one of the two parents that carry the health insurance, and then there's adjustments that are made due to the parent that's carrying that expense. The number of, I think I went through this. Oh, you're talking about costs other than the actual number that the chart puts out. So then what also comes into play is there extracurricular activities that you may agree upon that your child or children do, and how is that split up? Is there schooling that's being paid for? That can be optional because, there is public school and then there's private school, and people can make different agreements if they want with regard to that. And that is very family specific as to what these folks want to do. And then depending upon the age of your child, you may need to have childcare because people are working. Those are key factors that come involved. Another key factor that impacts how child support is calculated is the actual parenting schedule between the parents. And so depending upon the number of, it used to be nights that there was a change recently. It used to be the number of nights that the child or children are with one parent is kind of how it was calculated. Now that's changed to hours. Sometimes that can be difficult to be measured, but you can get the gist of it's based on timeshare as to, that can impact how child support obligations can flow from one parent to the other.
Well, I guess the theory is if the children were with parent A for a longer period of time or more time, there's additional meals, there are additional expenses, there are additional things that come into play, which is raising the child, day-to-day kind of stuff. So that parent should, again, that's factored in. It's not a 50-50. Maybe it becomes 60-40, or maybe it becomes even more in terms of the balance, because that parent does have more time with that child for whatever reason. But I like what you said back in the previous episode when you were talking about how really the court will listen if the two parents can actually agree on things that are just unique to that situation. A lot of times the court will go with it because it's like, okay, if you guys agree on that, we'll codify it here in the divorce settlement and move forward. So all these different factors come into play. Just because there's a worksheet out there, as you said earlier, it's a guideline. It's not the hard and fast rule. It's a starting point.
Correct. And so what happens is, it's a guideline to a degree with other things, as you point out, that factor in. Another part of this is that you can the guideline, the child support doesn't assume that parents make equal income, and so you can have a disparity in income, which is used to calculate in proportion to what your obligation is. And so if you have one parent that makes, for example, if you have one parent that makes $3,000 a month, I'm just going to try to make the numbers easy.
Sure.
If you have one parent that makes $3,000 a month and another parent that makes $6,000 a month, then what you have is you have one parent that's going to be responsible for, in proportion, a third of the expenses versus 2/3. And so it's an income sharing model, but there's a proportionality to it. And so, if the child support owed, if the guideline says for parents that make combined at $9,000 a month, for example, then you kind of break that out. Okay, for not, the income level is $9,000 a month. It spits out a number, whatever that number is, and then parent that makes double is going to be responsible for 2/3 of the support owed. Parent that makes half as much would be responsible for 1/3 of the amount owed, and that would transcend to credits for health insurance. That would transcend to child care. Education may be a little different. There could be special needs that are involved, and so there's all sorts of specific considerations that you would have to consider. But then when you factor in the parenting time, there can be an alteration based on the amount of time that you have, and then you can get a reduction in the amount owed based on the timeshare. That's kind of the shift from like a dollars to days model versus a more modern model of what's going on. And so when you start to calculate these things, then as you go through the calculation, then you figure out if money is in fact going to flow from one parent to the other. If it's not, if you have two parents that make equal money and they have a standard parenting schedule of 50-50, you would think, oh, there's not going to be any money that flows because everything's equal. But that doesn't consider health insurance premiums. That doesn't consider who might be fronting childcare. That doesn't consider any other additional things that may come up, uncovered medical expenses. Health insurance doesn't always pay for anything, and that would be split in proportion to income. Somebody may incur that expense, and then somebody may have to reimburse the other. So you have all sorts of things, and there's a chart that you go through, and it's not a perfect system, but it is the system that we have.
No, that makes sense. And then there's obviously extracurriculars. Johnny may want to play lacrosse, and you've got Susie over here who wants to take gymnastics or something like that. There are all these other expenses, and that needs to be determined who's going to split that up and how's that going to be handled. You mentioned this again in the previous episode. There is an opportunity to modify those child support calculations, those child support amounts over time. Do you want to kind of jump into that now?
Sure. So you have to kind of look at this in kind of a bird's eye view picture of a child that, you have a baby that's born, and then 18 years later, they're old enough to be an adult. Well, they're an adult now. If they are an adult, that's a different story. So when you look at that, you have to think over roughly 20 years, things are going to change. And so that doesn't mean that you can run to the courthouse every time there's some kind of minor change. It just would be impractical. And so there are standards in place to address changes as they come up. And so what happens is, in order to modify, you could move to increase child support for different reasons. Maybe people make more money. Maybe there's a circumstance where, and this is kind of getting into it a little bit, but maybe somebody had a previous relationship and they had a child support obligation for a previous child that's aged out, and they would get a reduction for the child that you may share, and that child's aged out, so that means that you could be entitled to an increase for that reason. So what courts look for are substantial and continuing changes in circumstances, and they kind of have some thresholds that they set. And so what you would look at, generally speaking, from strictly a math perspective, would be whether or not there's a 15% change in the amount paid based on some of these factors. So Did somebody get a raise? Did somebody get a new job? Did somebody lose their job? And then you have to get into kind of why, okay? And we can get into that a little bit. Was there a significant change in parenting time for some reason that would kind of shift or flip how this money is supposed to flow?
That makes sense. I mean, there are all of these variables, but I like what you said. The court doesn't want to be dealing with these petitions every month just because you assume there's a change. I mean, there are the thresholds in there, and that, again, these things take time. They can be somewhat expensive to get them going through the court system. There's always going to be an attorney fee there. But again, with these thresholds, and if you're in good consultation with your attorney, he or she's going to be able to guide you, George. You're going to be able to guide that client to say, maybe not yet, but okay, if this continues or if it's substantial enough, maybe we need to, go back to court on this.
That's a good point. You can also, and you can run into things where, clients may think, yes, I want to try to do this, but there could be another side to it.
Yeah.
And so it might not be time for a lot of different reasons. Back to some of the increase and decrease, we talked about a raise. We talked about maybe a loss of job. Now, people are supposed to work. In courts, generally speaking, if you're able-bodied and you can work, the courts say, yes, you're supposed to work. There's an amount of income that would be imputed to you. So you can't just not work and say, oh, I don't work, and so I don't have any income. The courts are going to impute some income to you. And, kind of forward thinking, would it just be minimum wage? I think as wages have increased, in certain respects, I don't know that it would just be minimum wage necessarily. I mean, if you drive down the street and see that, some job pays X amount and it's more than minimum wage, it could be that a court says, okay, I'm going to impute more than minimum wage to you. Or maybe you quit a job for whatever reason, and so maybe you earned at a level, and if you can show that somebody earned at a level for a consistent and sustained period of time, you would say, wait a minute, their income should be imputed to what they've made. Sometimes that can be based on education. Maybe somebody has the ability to earn and they just haven't for whatever reason. That gets more into, now you're talking about underemployment. Is somebody qualified to do a certain level of work and they're choosing not to? These are very fact-specific things to specific cases. And when you get into these issues, and when you get into discovery and you get into the exchange of information with regard to work history, et cetera, you start to find these things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's transition over to the topic of payment and kind of how it's done, what's expected, and things that you've, I guess, just seen in your experience.
Well, commonsensically, and it's like, it's not perfect, but commonsensically, if you're ordered or agreed to pay, you should pay. Courts expect you to pay. I think that that's pretty commonsensical. I think that whatever issues you may be having with the other parent that aren't on the financial side, if you're ordered to pay, courts expect you to pay. If you think there's a reason why you shouldn't pay, you should be proactive and maybe reaching out through the court system to say why not. So that's important. There's different ways the child support can be paid. It can be through the state child support enforcement agency. I believe every county has one. It kind of depends on where you are. It keeps everybody above board. You're paying through an intermediary. It's recording the payments. The money is flowing the way it's supposed to flow. There's a record. You can pull the records to keep everybody honest, so to speak. Some people choose not to do that. Obviously, you want to have a receipt and a record of every payment that you're ordered to pay. It would probably be a very good idea to keep records of things that maybe you're not ordered to pay, because that could come up. As far as there's other ways you can do it, you can have a wage assignment. And so some people choose to have a wage assignment. They just want it to come out of their check. It makes it easy. It keeps them honest. Some people pursue wage assignments.
And that's where the employer or the state basically takes that out even before you cash your check, right? It's almost like a garnishment.
It is a garnishment. It's absolutely a garnishment. There are some laws where a check, there's certain amounts that there's only so much that can be taken out. So you kind of have to, they could have other garnishments. But for the most part, some people, as I just said, some people choose to do it. Some people have to pursue it because not everybody pays as they should and not everybody pays on time. Sometimes that's intentional. Sometimes it's an oversight. And so when you pay, if you're ordered to pay and you pay, it's fine. If not, there's mechanisms that people may pursue. They may try to file a motion to hold you in contempt, of which you'll have to try to explain why you didn't pay, and there could be some reasonable defenses as to why not. And so, when you're going from soup to nuts, so to speak, you can sit there and say, okay, here we are. We have unmarried parents. Child support has to be calculated. At that point, maybe it needs to be modified over time. There's a payment or payments that need to be made. So let's go ahead and try to make sure that they're paid on time. And then, so that's kind of how that works. And then child support isn't forever. At some point, it can be terminated for different reasons. One of which is the child ages out. You don't pay for children when they're adults. Now, if they turn 18 and they're still in high school, it's until they finish high school. Stops when they're 19 at that point. And then, you have to affirmatively take the step to get it terminated. And so if you have a child that's turning 18 and aging out, you would want to make sure that you go to court and make sure that your obligation is terminated with the court, because only the court can stop an obligation.
Now, how does that happen if the child goes on to an accredited 4-year university or even a 2-year university? Does that extend that window of time?
No. No, it doesn't. I've seen people make agreements where it's kind of like paying for college. And so what happens is, instead of necessarily paying for college, I've seen an agreement where somebody has agreed to pay child support so long as the child is in college. The problem with that is twofold. It's kind of an open-ended agreement, and so it may not take them 2 years to finish college. It may not take them 4 years to finish college. They could, be a student enrolled. You to get into what that means. The other thing is that you don't necessarily know where you're going to be financially. What you're saying is you're making an agreement, and that would have to be by agreement. Okay, that would be a voluntary agreement, and I would be cautious to do that because you might not know what your financial situation is going to be when your child or children turn 18.
Yeah, at that point, better just to send a check and say, hey, just trying to help out, rather than legally obligate yourself to that ongoing payment.
I think that's a very good point. I think that parents are well-intended to do things, and I think that they want to do right by their kids, and I think that if you are able to do it and it works for you and you can voluntarily do it, that's one thing. If you have committed to doing that through the court system, you may, quite frankly, and not intentionally, have maybe bitten off more than you can chew. I think that you could be very well intended but unable to do that. So I would be cautious about agreeing to pay some form of I would be cautious about paying child support after your child has turned 18. Now, that doesn't mean that, just like you said, that doesn't mean that you can't help. That doesn't mean that you can't do whatever above and beyond. And you can do that while you're paying child support. If you want to, buy something that's not part of it, go ahead, but make it voluntary. But I would be cautious about committing yourself to financial obligations that you don't necessarily have to commit to, but you could satisfy the same notion by doing it voluntarily.
Right. Or at that time, maybe you switch and you just send the check to your child. Say, hey, just trying to help out with these other expenses. I mean, that's you. Again, once you're outside of that legal obligation, the child is aged out, you're still a parent. Do what you would do for your kiddo. I mean, that's just kind of normal stuff, I would think.
I think that's very well said.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, George, if somebody's listening to this and they decide, hey, you know what, this is a factor I need to know more about, or I need to get you involved early on because maybe a divorce is on the way, what's the best way for them to contact you?
The best way to contact me, you can call me on my cell phone. You can text me. It's 502-640-9797. You could email me at george@lambandlamb.com, and I'd be happy to take a look.
Outstanding. George, thank you for your time, and we'll be back in about 2 weeks with another episode.
Thank you.
Take care, guy. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Is It Time for a Lawyer podcast with attorney George Lamb. We hope you found the discussion informative and helpful. The comments George made are not meant to be legal advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish an attorney-client relationship. However, if it is time for a lawyer, George is ready to listen. Be sure to share this episode on your social media. George will be back in 2 weeks with his next episode. Thanks again for listening.